Marcus Thompson had been driving the same city bus route for 12 years, navigating the gritty streets of El Paso, Texas, with the mechanical precision of a man who had long ago accepted his place in life's grand scheme. At 42, he was unremarkable in every way that mattered to the world average height: thinning brown hair, a slight paunch from too many gas station burritos, and the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting him. This invisibility, Marcus had learned, was perhaps his greatest asset. Every morning at 5:47 a.m., Marcus would clock in at the El Paso Transit Authority depot, perform his mandatory vehicle inspection, and begin Route 23, a 40-mile circuit that wound through some of the city's most economically diverse neighborhoods. His route started in the affluent west side, meandered through the middle-class central districts, and terminated in the industrial zone near the Mexican border, where legitimate businesses operated alongside enterprises that preferred to conduct their affairs in cash and shadows. Marcus had always been observant. It was a trait that had served him well during his brief stint in the army, before a knee injury ended his military career and led him to civilian employment. While other drivers chatted with regular passengers or listened to music through earbuds, Marcus watched. He noticed patterns, routines, and the subtle details that others missed. It was this observational skill that first drew his attention to the unusual activity at 1247 Industrial Boulevard, a nondescript warehouse that sat at the end of his route, like a period at the end of a very long, boring sentence. For months, Marcus had watched as expensive SUVs with tinted windows arrived at precise intervals. Always between 2:15 and 2:30 p.m. on Tuesdays and Fridays, the vehicles would disappear into the warehouse's loading bay, remain for exactly 47 minutes, and then depart in different directions. The warehouse was officially registered to Southwest Logistics Solutions, a company that, according to public records, specialized in import-export consulting. But Marcus had noticed details that suggested the business was far more lucrative than legitimate logistics typically allowed. The security cameras were military-grade, the loading dock had been reinforced with steel plating, and the men who worked there carried themselves with the casual confidence of people accustomed to violence. More tellingly, Marcus had observed, the money dot had happened on a Tuesday in March, when his bus broke down directly across from the warehouse. While waiting for a replacement vehicle, Marcus had positioned himself at a bus stop with a clear view of the loading dock. Through his small binoculars, a habit left over from his army, days, he watched as men unloaded aluminum cases from an armored truck. The cases were handled with the kind of care reserved for either explosives or currency, and given the lack of bomb squad protocols, Marcus was confident it was the latter. Over the following weeks, Marcus began timing his route to coincide with these deliveries. He learned that the money arrived every Tuesday and Friday, was counted and sorted inside the warehouse, and was then distributed to various locations throughout the city on Wednesday and Saturday mornings. The operation was precise, professional, and almost certainly illegal. Marcus knew he was observing a cartel money laundering operation. El Paso's proximity to Juarez made it a natural hub for such activities, and the amounts of cash he estimated were being processed based on the number and size of the cases suggested this was a significant operation, possibly handling millions of dollars per week. A sensible man would have reported his observations to the authorities and continued driving his bus. Marcus Thompson, however, had reached a point in his life where sensibility felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. His ex-wife Sarah had remarried a successful attorney and moved to Austin with their teenage daughter Emma. His child support payments consumed nearly half his income, leaving him in a cramped studio apartment with a refrigerator that contained more condiments than actual food. His mother was in a nursing home that Medicaid barely covered, and his own retirement savings were virtually non-existent. At 42, Marcus faced the prospect of driving a bus for another 23 years, watching life pass by his windshield, while never actually participating in it. The realization had settled over him like a heavy blanket, suffocating his dreams and leaving him desperate for an escape route. The idea came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the desert. If he could somehow intercept even a fraction of the money flowing through that warehouse, he could disappear. He could start over somewhere far from El Paso, perhaps buy a small business, maybe even reconnect with his daughter once he had something to offer besides weekend visits to Chuck E. Cheese. Marcus began researching the warehouse operation with the methodical patience of a man who understood that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to shallow graves in the desert. He studied the delivery schedules, memorized the faces of the workers, and mapped the security protocols. He learned that the warehouse employed 6 full-time guards, all armed, and that the money was stored in a vault that required 2 keys to open. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the warehouse's greatest strength in routine was also its greatest vulnerability. The operation ran like clockwork, which meant that any disruption to that clockwork would create confusion and opportunity. Marcus's plan was elegantly simple. On Friday afternoons, after the money delivery, the warehouse workers would load cash into a white panel van for Saturday morning distribution. The van always took the same route through the city, making stops at 5 different locations. The third stop was at a check-cashing business on Alameda Avenue, where the van would park in an alley behind the building for approximately 15 minutes, while the driver and guard conducted their business inside. This 15-minute window was Marcus's opportunity. The beauty of the plan lay in its use of Marcus's greatest asset, his invisibility. As a city bus driver, he was part of the urban landscape, as unremarkable and overlooked as a stop sign or fire hydrant. More importantly, his bus route could be legitimately altered to accommodate mechanical issues or passenger emergencies that would place him in the right location at the right time. Marcus spent weeks refining the details. He studied the van security protocols and discovered that while the driver and guard were well trained, they followed predictable patterns. The driver always parked in the same spot in the alley, always locked the van, and always accompanied the guard into the building, leaving the vehicle unattended for those crucial 15 minutes. The van itself was armored but not impregnable. Marcus had learned during his army service that most civilian armored vehicles were designed to resist small arms fire and basic break-in attempts, but they weren't built to withstand the kind of sophisticated attack that a man with military training and unlimited preparation time could devise. Marcus's plan involved 3 phases: preparation, execution, and escape. The preparation phase required him to acquire certain specialized equipment and establish an alternate identity. The execution phase would last exactly 15 minutes and would require split-second timing. The escape phase would transform Marcus, Thompson, from a bus driver into a ghost. For the preparation phase, Marcus began slowly liquidating his few assets and converting everything to cash. He sold his car, his furniture, and even his mother's jewelry items he had kept for sentimental value but could no longer afford to maintain. The total came to just over $8,000, which he used to purchase the equipment he would need. The most important acquisition was a small but powerful cutting torch, the kind used by professional safety. Marcus bought it from a pawn shop in Albuquerque, paying cash and providing a fake name. He also purchased a motorcycle, a used Honda, that was fast enough for his purposes but common enough to blend into traffic. Creating an alternate identity proved more challenging but not impossible. Marcus had learned during his military service that the key to a successful false identity was not to create something from nothing, but to assume the identity of someone who had existed but was no longer using it. After weeks of research in public records, Marcus found his target, David Martinez, a man who had died in a car accident in Phoenix 3 years earlier but whose death had not been properly recorded in all databases. Using David Martinez's social security number and date of birth, Marcus was able to obtain a driver's license and open a bank account. He rented a storage unit under this identity and began stockpiling supplies, non-perishable food, camping equipment, and most importantly, a detailed plan for disappearing completely after the theft. The execution phase required Marcus to solve several complex logistical problems. First, he needed to disable the van's alarm system without triggering a silent alert to the security company. Second, he needed to cut through the van's armor plating quickly and quietly. Third, he needed to extract the money and escape before the driver and guard returned. Marcus solved the first problem by studying the van's security system during his surveillance. He discovered that the alarm was connected to the vehicle's electrical system and could be disabled by cutting specific wires in a precise sequence. This information came from a former colleague at the Transit Authority who had previously worked as an automotive electrician and was willing to share technical knowledge in exchange for beer and companionship. The second problem required Marcus to identify the van's weak points. Through careful observation, he determined that the rear doors, while armored, were attached to the vehicle with standard hinges that could be cut with his torch in under 5 minutes. The armor plating itself was designed to stop bullets, not sustained cutting attacks. The third problem, extraction and escape, was the most complex. Marcus calculated that he would have approximately 10 minutes to cut through the van, extract the money, and escape before the driver and guard returned. His solution was to use his city bus as both a shield and an escape vehicle. Marcus's plan called for him to position his bus in the alley in such a way that it would block the view of the van from the street while providing him with immediate access to an escape route. He would cut through the van's rear doors, extract as much money as possible, load it onto his bus, and then drive away as if responding to a radio call about an emergency elsewhere in the city. The genius of this approach was that it used the very system Marcus worked within as cover for his crime. City buses were constantly being redirected for emergencies, mechanical problems, and route changes. A bus appearing in an unusual location would raise no suspicions, especially if the driver could provide a plausible explanation for being there. Marcus spent weeks practicing every aspect of the plan. He timed himself cutting through metal plates similar to the van's armor. He rehearsed his movements until he could execute the entire sequence blindfolded. He memorized escape routes and identified safe houses where he could lay low if the plan went wrong. Most importantly, Marcus prepared himself psychologically for what he was about to do. He was not a criminal by nature, and the idea of stealing Evan from criminals went against his fundamental moral code. But desperation had a way of rewriting moral codes. and Marcus had reached a point where the risk of action seemed preferable to the certainty of a life spent in quiet desperation. As the date of his planned theft approached, Marcus found himself experiencing a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The routine that had numbed him for so long was about to be shattered, and while he couldn't predict what would happen next, he knew that anything was better than the slow death of unfulfilled dreams. On the Thursday before his planned Friday theft, Marcus made his final preparations. He confirmed that his equipment was in place, his escape routes were clear, and his alternate identity was secure. He also wrote a letter to his daughter, explaining his actions and expressing his love for her. The letter would be mailed only if the plan succeeded and he managed to escape. That night, Marcus Thompson went to bed for what he hoped would be the last time. Tomorrow, he would either be a free man with enough money to start over, or he would be dead. Either outcome seemed preferable to spending the rest of his life watching other people's lives through a bus windshield, as he lay in his narrow bed in his cramped apartment, listening to the sounds of the city that had trapped him for so long. Marcus allowed himself to imagine a different future. A future where he was more than just another invisible man in an invisible job. A future where David Martinez could build the life that Marcus Thompson had never been able to achieve. The plan was perfect. The timing was right. Tomorrow, Marcus would discover whether 12 years of careful observation and meticulous planning would be enough to outsmart a cartel's security and steal his way to freedom. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that seemed to mock the chaos Marcus was about to unleash. He woke at 4:30 a.m., 2 hours before his usual alarm, his body humming with nervous energy that felt like electricity coursing through his veins. Today was the day he would either transform his life or end it, and the weight of that knowledge made every mundane action feel surreal. Marcus went through his normal morning routine with mechanical precision, understanding that maintaining normalcy was crucial to his plan's success. He showered, shaved, and dressed in his standard Transit Authority uniform navy blue pants, light blue shirt, and the badge that identified him as employee number 4471. He ate his usual breakfast of instant coffee and a stale donut, though his stomach was too knotted with anxiety to appreciate the food. At 5:47 a.m., Marcus clocked in at the depot, exchanging the same meaningless pleasantries with his supervisor that he had shared for 12 years. "Morning, Marcus. How's the route looking today?" "Same as always. Gym should be a quiet Friday." The banality of the conversation felt like a performance. As if he were an actor playing the role of Marcus Thompson one final time, Marcus performed his pre-trip inspection with extra care, knowing that any mechanical problems with his bus could derail the entire operation. He checked the engine, tested the brakes, and verified that his radio was functioning properly. Everything had to be perfect because there would be no second chances. As he pulled out of the depot to begin Route 23, Marcus felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from outside his body. The familiar streets of El Paso rolled past his windshield like scenes from a movie he had watched too many times. But today, everything would change. The morning passed with agonizing slowness. Marcus picked up his regular passengers, the hospital workers heading to their early shifts, the construction crews bound for job sites, the students traveling to community college. He exchanged the same greetings, made the same stops, and followed the same route he had driven thousands of times before. But beneath his calm exterior, Marcus was running through his plan obsessively, checking and rechecking every detail. At 11:30 a.m., Marcus made his first deviation from routine. He radioed dispatch to report a minor mechanical issue that would require him to take his bus out of service for inspection at the maintenance facility. This was a common occurrence that would raise no suspicions and would provide him with the cover he needed to position himself for the afternoon's operation. "Copy that. Bus 47, came the dispatcher's board response. "Report to maintenance and we'll get you a replacement vehicle." Instead of heading to the maintenance facility, Marcus drove to a predetermined location 3 blocks from the warehouse district. He parked his bus in an alley behind an abandoned auto parts store, where it would be hidden from casual observation but easily accessible when he needed it. From his position, Marcus had a clear view of the warehouse at 1247 Industrial Boulevard. He settled in to wait, using his binoculars to monitor the facility's activity. At exactly 2:17 p.m., the familiar convoy of black SUVs arrived, disappearing into the warehouse's loading bay like clockwork. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he watched the money delivery unfold exactly as he had observed dozens of times before. The armored truck backed up to the loading dock, and men in expensive suits supervised as aluminum cases were unloaded and wheeled into the building. The entire process took 43 minutes, after which the armored truck departed and the warehouse settled into its usual afternoon routine. Now came the waiting. Marcus knew that the money would be counted, sorted, and prepared for distribution over the next several hours. The white panel van that would carry tomorrow's deliveries was already parked inside the warehouse, being loaded with the cash that Marcus intended to steal. At 4:45 p.m., Marcus moved to the second phase of his plan. He drove his bus to a position 2 blocks from the check cashing business on Alameda Avenue. parking in a spot that would allow him to reach the alley within minutes when the time came. He radioed dispatch again, this time reporting that he was responding to a passenger medical emergency that required him to deviate from his route. Copy that, Bus 47. Do you need medical assistance? Negative, dispatch. Passenger is stable, just need to get them to urgent care. This fiction would buy Marcus the time he needed without raising suspicions. Emergency medical situations were taken seriously by the transit authority, and drivers were given considerable discretion in how they handled such incidents. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe both the warehouse and the check cashing business. At 5:23 p.m., exactly on schedule, the white panel van emerged from the warehouse. Marcus watched through his binoculars as it made its way through the city, following the route he had memorized over weeks of surveillance. The van made its first stop at a restaurant on the east side, where the driver and guard spent 12 minutes inside before returning to their vehicle. The second stop was at an auto repair shop, where they remained for 8 minutes. Marcus felt his adrenaline building as the van approached the critical third stop. At 6:07 p.m., the white panel van turned into the alley behind the check cashing business on Alameda Avenue. Marcus watched as the driver parked in his usual spot, approximately 30 feet from the building's rear entrance. Both men exited the vehicle, the driver carrying a briefcase while the guard scanned the alley with professional paranoia before following his partner toward the building. Marcus waited. Exactly 90 seconds after the men disappeared inside before starting his bus, he drove quickly but carefully to the alley, positioning his vehicle to block the view of the panel van from the street. While leaving himself multiple escape routes. The moment of truth had arrived. Marcus grabbed his equipment bag and exited his bus, moving with the purposeful efficiency of a man who had rehearsed these actions hundreds of times in his mind. He approached the panel van from the rear, noting that the driver had indeed followed his usual pattern of parking in the exact same spot. The van's alarm system was Marcus's first obstacle. Using wire cutters and the technical knowledge provided by his former colleague, Marcus located the alarm's main power cable and cut it in the precise sequence that would disable the system without triggering a silent alert. The entire process took 47 seconds. Next, Marcus positioned his cutting torch at the junction where the van's rear doors met the frame. This was the weak point he had identified during his surveillance. The hinges were protected by armor plating, but the plating itself was attached with bolts that could be cut. The torch ignited with a sharp hiss, producing a brilliant blue flame that could cut through steel like butter. Marcus worked with steady precision, cutting through the bolts that secured the armor plating over the door hinges. The metal fell away in chunks, revealing the standard automotive hinges beneath. Cutting through the hinges took 3 minutes and 42 seconds. When the final cut was complete, the van's rear doors swung open, revealing the interior that Marcus had imagined but never seen. What he found exceeded his wildest expectations. The van's cargo area was lined with metal shelving, and every shelf was packed with bundles of cash. The money was organized by denomination and secured with rubber bands, creating neat stacks that filled the available space like a three-dimensional puzzle. Marcus estimated that he was looking at several $1 million in cash, but he didn't have time to count. According to his calculations, he had been working for 6 minutes and 37 seconds, leaving him approximately 8 minutes before the driver and guard returned. Marcus began transferring money from the van to his bus. Working with mechanical efficiency, he grabbed armloads of cash bundles and carried them to his vehicle, stacking them on the seats and in the aisles. The money was surprisingly heavy. Each bundle weighed several pounds, and Marcus quickly realized that he wouldn't be able to take everything. He focused on the largest denominations, grabbing bundles of hundreds and fifties while leaving the smaller bills behind. Even so, the amount of money he was transferring was staggering. Each trip from the van to his bus netted him what appeared to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. After 7 minutes of frantic loading, Marcus had filled his bus with approximately half of the van's contents. He estimated that he had stolen somewhere between $4 and $6 million, though an exact count would have to wait until he reached safety. Marcus made one final trip to the van, grabbing a last armload of cash before closing the damaged doors as best he could. The van still looked obviously compromised, but from a distance, it might not be immediately apparent that it had been robbed. Marcus returned to his bus and started the engine, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and exertion. According to his watch, he had been in the alley for 13 minutes and 22 seconds. If his timing calculations were correct, he had less than 2 minutes before the driver and guard returned. As Marcus pulled out of the alley, he radioed dispatch with a report that would provide cover for his location and activities. Dispatch, this is Bus 47. Medical emergency resolved. Patient transported to urgent care, returning to normal route. Copy that. Bus 47. Thanks for the updates. Marcus drove away from the scene with forced calm, maintaining normal speed and following traffic laws despite every instinct screaming at him to flee as quickly as possible. He knew that his escape depended on maintaining the appearance of normalcy for as long as possible. 3 blocks from the alley, Marcus allowed himself a quick glance in his rearview mirror. He saw no signs of pursuit, no indication that the theft had been discovered, but he knew that wouldn't last long. Once the driver and guard returned to find their van compromised, the entire criminal organization would mobilize to find the thief. Marcus had perhaps 30 minutes before the theft was discovered and reported. He needed to use that time to execute the final phase of his plan. Disappearing completely, Marcus drove his bus to the abandoned auto parts store where he had positioned his motorcycle earlier in the day. Working quickly, he transferred the stolen money from the bus to the motorcycle's cargo compartments and saddlebags. The bike couldn't carry as much as the bus, but it could carry enough. Marcus estimated he was taking approximately $3 million with him. The remaining money he left in the bus, knowing that it would eventually be discovered, but hoping that its presence would confuse investigators about the true scope of the theft. If they found some of the money, they might assume they had recovered everything. Marcus changed out of his transit authority uniform and into civilian clothes, stuffing his work clothes into a garbage bag that he would dispose of later. He also removed the GPS tracking device from his bus's small unit that the transit authority used to monitor vehicle locations. At 6:47 p.m., exactly 40 minutes after beginning his theft, Marcus Thompson climbed onto his motorcycle and rode away from his old life forever. Behind him, he left a disabled bus, a uniform that had defined him for 12 years, and an identity that had never brought him anything but disappointment. As he rode through the streets of El Paso for what he hoped would be the last time, Marcus felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had done it. He had actually pulled off what might have been the perfect crime, but Marcus knew that the real test was just beginning. Stealing the money had been the easy part. Now he had to disappear completely, evading both law enforcement and the cartel whose money he had stolen. Both groups would be highly motivated to find him, and both had resources that far exceeded his own. As the sun set over the desert, casting long shadows across the city that had been his prison for so long, Marcus Thompson rode toward an uncertain future behind him. He left chaos and confusion. Ahead of him lay either freedom or death. The transformation was complete. Marcus Thompson was dead. David Martinez was about to be born. The discovery of the theft occurred exactly 38 minutes after Marcus had driven away. When the driver and guard returned to find their van's rear doors hanging open like broken wings, the driver, a 20-year veteran of cartel security operations named Carlos Mendez, stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Dios mío, the guard whispered, crossing himself as he stared at the empty shelving where millions of dollars had been stored just minutes before. Carlos immediately pulled out his encrypted phone and dialed a number he hoped he would never have to use. The voice that answered was cold and precise, belonging to a man known only as El Contador, the accountant who managed the cartel's financial operations in the El Paso corridor. "We have a problem," Carlos said, his voice barely steady. "The Friday delivery, it's gone." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but to Carlos, it felt like hours. When El Contador finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm that preceded extreme violence. "How much?" "All of it. Maybe 6 million, maybe more. Witnesses? None that we saw. Whoever did this knew our schedule, knew our route. This wasn't random. Stay there. Touch nothing. We're coming." Within 20 minutes, the alley behind the check-cashing business was filled with expensive SUVs and men in dark suits, who moved with the efficient brutality of professional killers. El Contador arrived in a black Escalade, stepping out of the vehicle like a businessman arriving at a board meeting. He was a small, neat man in his 50s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they saw, including human lives. El Contador examined the damaged van with the methodical attention of a forensic investigator. He noted the precision of the cuts, the professional quality of the work, and the fact that the thief had disabled the alarm system without triggering any alerts. "This was not a street criminal," he announced to his assembled men. "This was someone with training, someone who studied our operation for weeks or months." While El Contador analyzed the crime scene, his lieutenants were already implementing the cartel's response protocol. Phone calls were made to corrupt police officers who would ensure that the official investigation moved slowly and in the wrong direction. Security camera footage from surrounding businesses was being acquired or destroyed. Witnesses were being identified and either bought or intimidated into silence. But the cartel's most valuable asset in situations like this was their network of informants throughout the city. Within hours, they would know about every unusual activity, every suspicious behavior, every person who had suddenly come into unexpected money. Meanwhile, Marcus was executing the most critical phase of his escape plan. He had ridden his motorcycle to a storage facility on the outskirts of El Paso, where he had rented a unit under his David Martinez identity. Inside the unit, he had stockpiled everything he would need for his new life: clothes, camping equipment, non-perishable food, and most importantly, the documents that would allow him to disappear completely. Marcus transferred the stolen money from his motorcycle to a series of duffel bags, working quickly but carefully to avoid damaging the bills. As he handled the cash, the reality of what he had accomplished began to sink in. He was holding more money than he had ever imagined possessing, enough to buy a new identity, a new life, and freedom from the grinding poverty that had defined his existence for so long. But Marcus knew that the money was also a death sentence if he was caught with it. The cartel would not simply kill him, they would make his death a message to anyone else who might consider stealing from them. He needed to move quickly and carefully to avoid that fate. Marcus had spent months planning his disappearance, studying the methods used by people who had successfully vanished from their old lives. The key, he had learned, was not to run as far as possible, but to become someone else entirely. Running suggested guilt and desperation. Transformation suggested planning and intelligence. The first step was to abandon his motorcycle and acquire different transportation. Marcus had purchased a used pickup truck under his David Martinez identity, parking it at a different storage facility across town. He loaded the money into the truck and drove to a third location, where he had hidden camping supplies and outdoor equipment. Marcus's plan was to disappear into the vast wilderness of the American Southwest, where a man with cash and survival skills could live off the grid for months or even years. He had identified dozens of remote locations where he could establish temporary camps, moving frequently to avoid detection while he planned his next moves. But first, he needed to create confusion about his disappearance. Marcus drove his bus to a location near the Rio Grande, where he abandoned it in a spot that would suggest he had fled across the border into Mexico. He left behind personal items that would reinforce this theory: his wallet, his identification, and a handwritten note in Spanish that suggested he had gambling debts to dangerous people. The note was a masterpiece of misdirection, written in Marcus's deliberately poor Spanish and designed to make investigators believe he had been forced to flee the country to escape loan sharks. It mentioned specific bars and gambling establishments in Juarez, providing false leads that would send investigators in the wrong direction. Marcus also left behind evidence suggesting that he had been planning his escape for weeks. He planted fake receipts for travel to Mexico, created false email accounts with messages about crossing the border, and even left behind Spanish language learning materials that suggested he had been preparing for life in a foreign country. The goal was to make his disappearance look like the desperate flight of a man in debt, rather than the calculated escape of a master thief. If investigators believed he had fled to Mexico with empty pockets, they would be less likely to connect him to the cartel robbery. By midnight on Friday, Marcus had completed his transformation. He had abandoned his old identity, established his new one, and positioned himself to disappear into the wilderness. He drove his pickup truck north toward the mountains of New Mexico, where he had identified several remote locations that would serve as temporary hideouts. As he drove through the desert night, Marcus monitored news reports on his radio. Theft had not yet been reported to the media. The cartel preferred to handle such matters privately, but Marcus knew that wouldn't last long. Eventually, the story would break, and when it did, he needed to be far from El Paso and completely untraceable. Marcus's first hideout was an abandoned mining camp in the Gila National Forest, a location so remote that it didn't appear on most maps. He had discovered it during a camping trip years earlier and had returned several times to cache supplies and prepare the site for emergency use. The camp consisted of a few crumbling buildings and a network of abandoned mine shafts that provided both shelter and hiding places for his money. Marcus had waterproofed several of the shafts and hidden supplies throughout the area, creating a network of resources that would allow him to survive for months if necessary. As dawn broke over the mountains, Marcus sat beside a small campfire, drinking coffee and counting his stolen fortune. The final tally was $5.7 million more money than he had ever dreamed of possessing. It was enough to buy a new identity, a new life, and freedom from the poverty that had trapped him for so long. But Marcus also knew that the money came with a price. The cartel would never stop looking for him, and neither would law enforcement. He would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, never able to completely relax or trust anyone. As he sat in the wilderness, surrounded by the vast silence of the desert, Marcus reflected on the choices that had brought him to this moment. He had been an ordinary man, living an ordinary life, trapped by circumstances and limited by his own lack of imagination. But desperation had transformed him into something else: a master thief who had outsmarted one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America. The transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. Marcus Thompson was dead, but David Martinez was just beginning to live. And somewhere in the distance, the hunt for the man who had stolen $6 million from a cartel was about to begin in earnest. 3 days after the theft, the story finally broke in the local media. City bus driver vanishes after massive cartel robbery, read the headline in the El Paso Times. The article described Marcus Thompson as a desperate man who had fled to Mexico after stealing millions of dollars from organized crime figures. The FBI opened an investigation, but their efforts were hampered by the cartel's interference and the false leads that Marcus had carefully planted. Investigators followed his trail to the border, where it seemed to disappear into the chaos of Juarez's criminal underworld. Meanwhile, the cartel conducted its own investigation with methods that the FBI could never employ. They questioned witnesses with techniques that guaranteed honest answers, searched properties without warrants, and followed leads with a persistence born of the knowledge that failure meant death. But both investigations were chasing a ghost. Marcus Thompson had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only questions and a legend that would grow with each retelling. In the mountains of New Mexico, David Martinez read about the search for Marcus Thompson with detached interest, like a man reading about events in a foreign country. The transformation was so complete that he sometimes had to remind himself that he had once been the man they were hunting. Marcus had planned for a life on the run, but he had not anticipated how completely he would be able to disappear. His meticulous preparation and careful execution had created a perfect crime, not just the theft itself, but the vanishing act that followed, as weeks turned to months. The search for Marcus Thompson gradually faded from the headlines. The FBI moved on to other cases. The cartel focused on rebuilding their security, and the world forgot about the bus driver who had outsmarted them all. But in the wilderness of the American Southwest, a man who had once been invisible was finally free. He had stolen more than money from that cartel van. He had stolen a new life, a second chance, and the freedom to become whoever he chose to be. The perfect crime was complete, and Marcus Thompson had achieved the ultimate disappearing act. He had vanished so completely that even he sometimes forgot who he used to be. The end. Legal disclaimer. This story is entirely fictional and has been created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely coincidental. The story does not endorse or encourage illegal activities of any kind.